G'day and welcome to another episode of Kiwi Car Life. And a very sizable number of years ago, probably 4 years ago now, I reviewed a FN2 Civic Type R. And at the time it was the only and first Type R Honda that I'd driven, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. But since then I've had the pleasure of driving pretty much every single other Type R that's been made. And I was given the opportunity to revisit the FN2 now 3 or 4 years since I last drove one. So it's going to be really interesting to see what I think of it now 4 years removed. In terms of exterior styling, Honda absolutely went to town on this particular model. It's got really interesting styling at the front with these sort of long swooping skinny lights and the weird triangle shaped fog lights. And overall it just kind of has the proportions of a egg looking car with the funny looking door handles, and it's got the triangle shaped tips at the back and so on, and you combine all these things together and it just doesn't look like anything else on the road. The engine, even though it looks basically the same as the K20A found in the FD2, which was the other Civic Type R sold from this sort of generation of Honda, this one is actually a K20 Z4, which means it makes a little bit less power. We're talking 200 horsepower, 147 kilowatt, and 196 Newton meters of torque. So it's about 10 Newton meters and 20 horsepower down on the full fat Type R K20A that you got in some of the other Type R models from the early 2000s. However, it still makes a pretty solid amount of power for a naturally aspirated 2-litre engine. It's paired up with a 6-speed manual. It's got a limited slip differential. This one has an HKS pod filter and a J's Racing exhaust. And so naturally, even though it's perhaps not making quite the power of some of the other models, the VTEC on this will still sound absolutely fantastic, and it'll still rev to over 8,000 RPM. And finally, the interior. My, what an unusual place this is to sit. The steering wheel is lifted straight out of the FD2 or the Jazz from the same era, which I'm quite familiar with, but then everything else is just so incredibly unusual. The wraparound dash here with the very unique looking gauges in the middle is certainly a very interesting design. All your climate controlled stuff up here falls very easily to hand and displays on the screen up there, but it's all sort of unusually laid out, and the passenger side temperature is literally on the door. But the build quality in typical Honda fashion is pretty darn good. The steering wheel feels great, the seats are excellent, the manual change on this is really good. It's got a cool little sporty starter button over here, the indicators and wipers feel nice, and all the other buttons that you have all over the place still feel really good. And even though this is a Type R model, it still has Bluetooth and reversing camera now. It's got parking sensors, traction control, all this good stuff that definitely makes this Type R the most featuresome and livable Type R to date. Driving the FN2 Civic Type R. Oh yeah. It feels much like my Euro R, where it is very much lacking in torque. I remember at the time I was like so impressed with like how well it went, because you know I was used to driving a 1.5 litre Jazz every day, and so getting in an FN2 suddenly felt like the fastest car in the world. But you know, out of VTEC, it's certainly not the quickest thing ever, but the steering feel is excellent. And the engines in these, I don't know what it is about the particular intake manifold that they have, but they sound quite different to every other Honda K series that I've ever heard. They almost have a more sort of K24 sound to them. Oh yeah. The VTEC engagement on these too is very different to what I'm used to, where you get the sound change, but there's not really too much of an increase in power, if I'm honest. It just kind of changes the tone, but it doesn't actually really feel like it's going any quicker. Gear ratios are great though. So fun. It's just such a nice sounding engine, and it does go pretty good at the higher RPMs. I mean, it's only sort of just under 200 horsepower, so it's not going to blow your socks off, but it does definitely get up and go really nicely. And if you want it to, it'll rev down the gears real quick too. Seats are good. Oh, I just love that. Everything just feels so tight. The steering, the seats, the transmission, the engine, everything on it is just good. Now obviously, you know, if I'm being honest, it's not the quickest thing ever. now that I've had the pleasure of driving the FK8, the FD2, the EP3, the FN2, I can see why people kind of consider it to be the ugly duckling. But I guess the problem is that this is a fantastic car that's in some company of some outstanding cars. And so it's very hard for it to compete with the likes of, say, you know, the FD2, which is just such an incredible car. But if you're looking at this compared with like a Golf GTI or something, it's really, really good. It's got some of the best transmission feel that you will have in any car. It revs way higher than most other 4-cylinders you'll find in cars from this era, which is a unique point. Transmission's great. And you can just hammer through the gears. At the time, like I said, I was pretty biased towards it, and you know, because it was sort of my first experience of proper VTEC and a proper Type R Honda, I just thought it was like the best thing ever. And revisiting it all these years later, you know, it's not the best car I've ever driven. Even Honda, you know, within Honda's own lineup, there's obviously better cars out there, but it's still really, really good. And if you're considering a hot hatch, or you want something that's kind of a bit of an oddball or something like that, then I would strongly recommend considering one of these, because you know, they're kind of the one Type R Honda that hasn't shot through the ceiling in terms of price. And it's certainly no less of a Type R Honda because of it. And overall, mate, you just can't go wrong. So there we go. Thanks very much for watching this episode of Kiwi Car Life, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next time.